The Explanation is the podcast from the BBC World Service that goes beyond the spin, exploring the important questions about long-running stories and the latest global news. An honest explanation of the events shaping our lives. Search for The Explanation wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Welcome to The Inquiry with me, Tanya Beckett. One question, 4 expert witnesses and an answer. When the leaders of 9 European countries broke from talks at the end of September in Malta, they had the makings of an agreement to tackle arguably the most complicated problem currently facing the bloc. Over 200,000 migrants have reached the borders of Europe so far in 2023, and the number is growing year on year. The war in Ukraine has certainly added to the recent influx, but underpinning the increase is the number of boats making their way across the Mediterranean from North Africa. Among the pledges was help for Italy to cope with the mass of people heading to its shores and a relocating of some of the arrivals within the EU. There was also talk of more funding to crack down on smugglers. But within days, the nascent agreement had hit a roadblock. Poland and Hungary, both opposed to taking in migrants themselves, were not prepared to pay money to their southern peers to help cover the cost of hosting them. This week on The Inquiry, we're asking, can Europe solve its migrant crisis?
Part 1. The Causes.
Our first expert witness is Hannah Behrens, Director of Migration Policy Institute Europe, based in Brussels.
It's a big problem because it's a theme that's currently dominating elections in so many different parts of Europe, but also other parts of the globe.
Europe's migration crisis began in 2015, when the arrival of over 1 million refugees fleeing in part the war in Syria left the EU struggling to respond. Since then, other factors have led migrants to head for European shores, not least the war in Ukraine. Since Russia's invasion at the start of last year, over 4 million Ukrainians have sought protection within the European Union.
In the last years, we had predominantly persons arriving from countries which were affected by war or internal conflict. So top nationalities were Syrians, Afghanis, sometimes also other countries at war like Eritrea and Ethiopia, so protracted conflict. We have climate-related hardship, which is exacerbating either wars or economic instability. And we also have the remnants of the COVID-19 pandemic. That had resulted in huge impact on economies, especially the tourism sector.
The collapse of tourism during the pandemic has indeed played a major role. In North Africa, Tunisia's economy in particular is very dependent on visiting travellers and was decimated during the pandemic. That, a more autocratic leader and civil strife in neighbouring Libya have all led to a surge in departures of people from the region. Unlike Ukrainians, the majority of those leaving North Africa are not entitled to travel to the European Union without a visa. It's very unlikely that one would be granted, which means that official ferry crossings are not an option. And so they turn to smugglers.
For example, the Libyan Coast Guard has intercepted about 24,000 people already this year. The Turkish Coastal Guard has intercepted 50,000. We know that people who are intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard often arrive in very deplorable and horrid situations in detention centres.
Those who do make it to the sea are at risk of their boat capsizing on the journey. International maritime law dictates that any boat that sees another in distress must offer assistance to those who are on board.
There's a lot of disputes in the past years about which vessels should intervene, but also if a vessel rescues people at sea, where they can actually disembark. We've seen a lot of disputes, for example, in Italy or Spain, who refuse to have people disembark and say that they should return to either the country of origin or should return to another country in the Mediterranean Sea.
Nearly 2,000 migrants perished in the first half of 2023 alone. For those who complete the journey, it's often difficult for authorities to distinguish between smugglers and migrants who've been drawn into the smugglers' operations.
They cannot afford a fee entirely, so they agree to participate or work in undeclared markets or alike upon arrival, but also they may get stuck along the route because they no longer have any money and the smugglers ask for more. And because of that, and because of the money running out, actually being drawn into these criminal activities and hence being forced to support, for example, being on the lookout for coast guards or police officers or alike who may intercept them.
Those who succeed in reaching Europe's borders are currently processed according to the EU's so-called Dublin regulation, which states that migrants must be assessed for asylum in the country where they first land. The wait to be processed can last months or longer in circumstances that are often exceptionally difficult, and although proposals have been made to streamline the procedure, it's not clear how quickly these changes will come about.
The number of suicide attempts by not only adults but also a rising number of children in Greek facilities is going up. Many are now living also in containers, which in summer times go up to more than 40 degrees. There are limited facilities also for accessing water, for showering, and hence the level of desperation among those people is extremely high, and that may then in turn explain why they are such an easy target for smugglers who give them the illusion at least of being able to move out of that desperate situation and go to a new place where potentially further desperation faces them and where smugglers again may seek to abuse the situation.
Time for our next expert witness.
Part 2, the shore.
I think the system is prone to creating a lot of backlogs, and so the congestion and overcrowding is sort of also generated by policies.
Our second expert witness is based in Ireland.
I'm Catherine Costello, and I'm a full professor of global refugee and migration law at the Sutherland School of Law in University College Dublin.
The 1951 Geneva Convention states that protection should be offered to individuals who face persecution in their own country, and on this basis the EU offers asylum to some of the migrants who arrive in Europe. But in recent years, member countries have also made broader one-off policies.
So in 2015 and in early 2016 in Germany, there was a decision saying, look, we have a lot of Syrian applicants. We know that they are all in need of international protection. We will just offer them protection very quickly. And that was done informally. There are also the Ukrainian example where a collective decision was made to offer people temporary protection, which means that Ukrainians simply have to register and they enjoy that protection. So, there are lots of ways of making swift, positive decisions about international protection.
In a majority of cases, though, the application for asylum is rejected.
If they've had a fair asylum proceeding, if all of their other reasons for being protected have been examined and rejected, then somebody is deportable. And then the state can use force to do that. So states do use force to deport people. It's a highly coercive governmental act. So the person's will can be overcome. That's why deportation is such a serious matter and why legal safeguards have to be in place.
But deportation to where? This is arguably the most difficult question.
Sometimes states don't want their own nationals back, or they will contest the claim that somebody is a national of that particular country. Or certainly if states are trying to return somebody who isn't a national of that country, then you really have to incentivize the state to take somebody back. And under normal conditions, it's not obvious why any state would want to take back somebody or host people who are not its own nationals.
In this context, the EU has made arrangements with Turkey, Libya and Tunisia, which allows the bloc to return migrants and supply money for border control to try to stop them from leaving in the first place. This sounds like a logical solution, but in fact it is fraught with difficulties for many reasons. two of which are human rights and corruption.
For example, the EU funds a lot of activities of the notorious Libyan Coast Guard. And the Libyan Coast Guard, we know there's very strong evidence, is an entity that's complicit in torture and creating inhuman and degrading detention conditions in Libya, as well as, on some occasions, engaging in practices that actually directly imperil life at sea. If people are trying to leave Libya on rickety boats, there's some very strong evidence that they don't just pull those boats back, but they also, on some occasions, actually engage in conduct that's putting life at risk.
Not only that, paying money to third countries to take migrants means that these nations then become incentivised to allow more departures rather than fewer.
You create a very dangerous migration diplomacy because you create a situation where countries like Turkey, or really any third country on whom the EU is depending, can play a game with the lives of migrants. It can induce people to make dangerous crossings, knowing that that very quickly becomes a political crisis for the EU. It can effectively extort the EU in relation to not only migration, but a whole host of other policy areas. So it creates a very dangerous tool, and it empowers, as we know from many, many examples, lots of other authoritarian practices. So it has a whole lot of spillover effects that I think are politically unwanted as well.
In short, the deportation of migrants back to their own country is often difficult. Transferring them to a third is fraught, arguably with even more complications.
It's not a quick fix. It's very rarely going to be legal to send somebody swiftly to a third country and imagine, well, this is an easy way to remove refugees from our territory.
The consequence is that many migrants who are not offered asylum status are simply not returned or sent to a third country, but for prolonged periods stay where they are.
That world has eaten up and spit out a lot of young and attractive guys.
This is the story of one of fashion's dark secrets.
I was overwhelmed. I had never seen anything like this.
At the height of Abercrombie & Fitch's success,
This was me being carefully manipulated.
Being lied to, tricked, and traded like a commodity.
investigating allegations that would take me into a world of money, sex, and power. This is World of Secrets, Season 1, The Abercrombie Guys.
Search for World of Secrets wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Time for our next expert witness.
Part 3. Workers.
My name is Charles Kenny. I'm a senior fellow at the Centre for Global Development in Washington, D.C.
Just as in Italy, September was a busy month for migrant arrivals, in Greece several thousand also reached the country's shores. The arrivals coincided with the country's harvest, and Greek farmers were struggling to find enough workers to pick their crops, and they watched in desperation as their efforts to grow food started to go to waste. Not only that, the country was also short of workers in its tourism and construction industries. So Athens drew up a plan to offer visas to up to 300,000 migrants. Our third expert witness says this is the type of response many other countries should also consider.
There are factories that need workers. There are farms that need people to pick the crops. And if you don't have the workers there, all of that capital, all of those firms, they go bust. And so the economy as a whole shrinks. And this is a problem that Europe is currently facing.
Within the European Union, the proportion of people of working age is getting smaller. This means quite simply that in future, fewer and fewer people will be supporting a larger and larger population of retirees. Charles says that several countries are already taking steps to solve the problem.
We're going to see a massively increasing demand for migrants in richer and upper middle income countries. We're already seeing it. We're already seeing countries desperately changing their visa policies and their migration policies to make themselves more attractive to migrants because they need the workers because their own workforce is aging and retiring.
But in a situation where you are getting a lot of migrants of varying skills, how do you design a policy which accepts those who fit the criteria that you need to be fitted, and reject those who do not fit those criteria? That's a complicated issue, isn't it?
So one technique is to go to potential sending countries in Africa, in India, elsewhere, and work with governments there to create the skills base. So train up workers in India, in Ethiopia, in Morocco for the skills you want, and then provide some of them legal and safe pathways to come to Germany, the rest of Europe, and use those skills to their own benefit and to the receiving countries.
There is an ethical question here, though, isn't there? That what we're suggesting is taking the brightest and the best out of countries which really need them to stay in order to boost their economies.
If you look at the Indian tech boom, it started because a whole bunch of Indians who'd been working in Silicon Valley came back to India and founded companies that are now doing tens, hundreds of billions of exports. So it's not a loss to those countries. Furthermore, if people know that they're going to have a big opportunity if they get skills, they're more likely to get those skills in the first place.
Should we think more along the lines then of allowing people visas for a distinct period of time, after which they take whatever they've learned back to their home countries in order to benefit them?
Sure, for some jobs, as long as it's well paid and the migration paths are safe, I think that's a good answer. I will say, if you make migration illegal and difficult, one of the results is people don't want to do temporary migration. They stay instead. Once they've gone through the immensely difficult path of entering a country undocumented, they're darned if they're going to turn around and go home and have to do it again, right? So they stay. So if you want to have more temporary migrants, you have to make the legal environment to be a temporary migrant much more attractive than it is at the moment.
But the solution to loosen up migration rules really presumes that the problem is simply an economic one, and it's not. It's largely a social one, that the receiving countries feel overwhelmed, or they're run by politicians who have elections to win and see this pretty much at the top of the list. So how do you get round that particular issue?
I agree it is far more than an economic issue, and there are frankly legitimate concerns around making sure that there are enough houses, there's enough school places, there's enough hospitals in order to provide care to all. But as it becomes more and more obvious how much Europe is going to need migrants, I think it's going to become less and less a good issue for populists to turn to try and drum up support.
There is indeed a tension here. On the one hand, Europe has a shortage of workers. On the other, its right-wing leaders, which include Hungary, Poland and Italy, have pledged to their voters to clamp down on migration. In the wake of several thousand migrants arriving on the tiny island of Lampedusa in September, Italy's Premier Giorgia Meloni began pushing for a blockade in the Mediterranean Sea to stop the flow of boats. Time for our fourth expert witness.
Part 4, Policy.
I think an effective migration policy and effective asylum policies going forward requires better cooperation with non-EU countries, but also a much clearer and much more effective way of implementing solidarity within the European Union.
That solidarity was tested in October in Grenada. When EU leaders met for the European Political Community Summit, talks exposed several divides over how to progress the EU's pact on migration and asylum. Amongst the differences, Mediterranean nations want more help from countries who are not facing an influx of boats from North Africa. Poland, which has already accepted millions of migrants since Russia's invasion, joins Hungary in being opposed to any agreement to redistribute migrants across Europe.
My name is Martin Roos, and I'm based at the Migration Policy Centre of the European University Institute in Florence.
As we have said, the Dublin regulation means that migrants apply for asylum in the country that they first reach. Many arrive from across the water in Spain and Greece, but most migrants coming from North Africa land in Italy, and predominantly the tiny Italian island of Lampedusa.
Italy is saying, well, we need help from other countries, and that help needs to include a degree of relocation, meaning that the other countries have to help us process some of these asylum claims, or at least financially we need help in other ways. It's obviously the frontline states that are often very skeptical about new proposals that require them to do all kinds of new things stricter border controls, more efficient asylum processing, but without more effective solidarity.
This solidarity would take the form of payments or logistical support, for example in processing applicants for asylum and distributing them to other EU countries.
What is currently being proposed is that there will be some relocation of asylum seekers and refugees from Italy, say, to other countries, such as Germany. Or if countries do not want to accept refugees through that relocation system, then the current proposal is that they have to pay. So the EU has moved away, at least these proposals have moved away from the idea of mandatory relocation mechanisms, so the idea of flexible solidarity in the sense that everybody has to contribute to helping address this issue.
There is, of course, another important question, and that is of border controls within Europe itself. Most countries are part of the Schengen zone and don't have routine checks at internal borders. Amid a surge in the number of migrants, some member countries have started to reintroduce them.
Some politicians have presented these issues in terms of a trade-off, essentially arguing that we can only have free and unrestricted migration within Europe if Europe's borders are strong. And so there's also a debate, of course, about how Schengen, how the free movement of people within Europe is linked to external migration controls. If you drive in your car from Italy to Austria, nobody will stop you under normal circumstances. So yes, in response to some of these concerns about migration, there are now spot checks in various places to see exactly who is traveling. But within a free movement area, of course, it is not so easy to control the movement of people across countries.
Voters wanting a humane response to the problem and yet also wanting to preserve their societies has become an extremely difficult balance.
Many people are conflicted within their own heads between, on the one hand, the goal of offering some protection, but then also wanting some control. One way of addressing this, of course, is to use different types of policy control. So you provide protection, but you also talk about limits and conditions. And of course, that covers a wide range of policies, but it's how to balance a degree of control with the overarching aim of what asylum and refugee policy should be about, namely protection. It is the main challenge.
Now we return to our question. Can Europe solve its migrant crisis? Europe has tried to stem the flow of migrants by striking deals with other countries outside its borders. But such deals become tangled with difficult questions over whether money used does indeed help solve the problem. The same can be said of efforts to stimulate economies from which migrants originate. Making sure that aid reaches the right people has long been a very tangled question. EU leaders want to come to an agreement, but there are fundamental differences over what that agreement would contain because of the differences as to how the problem should be tackled. The migrant crisis has many causes and requires an equal number of solutions. One of the difficulties we faced in making this documentary was getting hold of accurate numbers. The Prime Ministers of Italy and Britain have recently pledged to exchange intelligence, which is one of the places they need, at least to begin. Another would be to front up to their voters that boats full of migrants crossing the Mediterranean is not the cause of the problem. It is, in fact, just a symptom. This inquiry was presented by me, Tanya Beckett, produced by Jill Collins, researched by Matt Tolson and edited by Tara McDermott. The studio manager was James Bradshaw.